Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Odds are you clicked this video because you're mad about the title and you're already scrolling down to the comments to yell at me for insulting the greatest composer who ever lived, and look, I get it, I do. But before you do that, hear me out because this is about so much more than just Beethoven. If you let me make my case and you still want to leave that angry comment, then by all means be my guest. But first, I think it's worth asking the question, is Beethoven really the greatest composer who ever lived? And more importantly, how do you know? This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Let's start with a simple question. How much of Beethoven's music are you actually familiar with? I mean, look, I don't know you, maybe you're a superfan who knows every surviving piece by heart, but I think it's much more likely that you can hum the themes from certain portions of his 5th and 9th symphonies, maybe a couple bars of Für Elise, and that's about it. For most people, the idea that Beethoven is the greatest composer who ever lived isn't tied to any sort of personal experience with his music. It's just a fact of life. Water is wet, the sky is up, and Beethoven is great. Challenging that idea is like arguing that fire is cold. It's not so much a difference of opinion as it is a contradiction of terms. But that's weird, right? For most artists, if you're not that familiar with their work, you probably don't have strong opinions about them, and if you do, those opinions are probably negative. So what makes Beethoven the exception? Why does he get to be treated as a visionary composer by people who don't seem that interested in the music he composed? Well, the short answer is that he's the biggest name in what's called the Western Classical Canon. Broadly speaking, a canon is basically just an officially recognized list. This comes up a lot in religious contexts. The Bible, for instance, has a canon. There's a set of books that are officially considered to be genuine, like Genesis, while others are apocrypha, which means they don't count. We see canons in modern media too. Star Wars has a canon, X-Men has a canon. If you want to figure out what's going on in a story, the canon is the set of sources you're officially allowed to check. The Last Jedi is a part of the Star Wars canon, whereas Darth Vader's appearance in Soul Calibur 4 is not. We can also use the idea of a canon to describe groups of people so widely recognized as great that they seem to be officially ordained. There's a canon of poets like Shakespeare, of artists like Da Vinci, of scientists like Einstein, and most important for our purposes, a canon of musicians like Beethoven. Or more precisely, there's a bunch of musical canons for different cultures and genres. I could have called this video Pink Floyd Sucks at Music and got a whole different group of people mad at me. But in terms of cultural influence, the classical canon is by far the most important one, so I'm going to be focusing on that. Besides, I'd like to see Beethoven try to write Welcome to the Machine. This presents a bit of a problem though, because unlike the Bible or Star Wars, the classical canon has no official governing body. At best, its contents are dictated by the programming decisions of major symphony orchestras, but in reality, the people crafting those programs are just as much responding to demand as they are setting it. They don't play Beethoven just because they think he's great, they also play him because he sells, and he sells partly because people in their target audience like his music, but also partly because those people tend to view liking Beethoven as a sign of class and taste. Of course, both the orchestra and the audience probably do like Beethoven, but they're also contributing to an ongoing effort to reinforce his place at the top of the canon. I'm not saying it's intentional, I'm just saying it happens, and it means that in order to determine who truly belongs in the canon, we can't just check a list somewhere. We have to set the boundaries ourselves, so for our purposes, I'm going to say that the canon is the set of classical composers whose names I could have plausibly used in the title of this video to make regular symphony goers mad. That list starts with the big three, Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach, and then we get others like Haydn, Handel, Brahms, Chopin, Tchaikovsky, Liszt, you get the picture. So how did we get here? Well, in order to understand that, we're gonna have to travel back in time to visit one of the canon's oldest members, Johann Sebastian Bach. In Bach's time, the idea that his music would still be performed and celebrated almost 300 years after his death would have seemed ridiculous. That just wasn't how music worked. At the time, the main business model for a musician like Bach was to enter into service to a specific patron and write music to suit that patron's tastes. When people went to a musical performance, they expected something new. In a blog post on the topic, Dr. Linda Shaver-Gleason references a quote from 15th century theorist Johannes Tinctoris, who wrote that the only music worth listening to was that which had been written in the last 40 years. By that standard, we shouldn't even be listening to Hendrix anymore, let alone Bach. This attitude, which persisted for centuries, meant that once a composer died and thus stopped writing new music, their work naturally faded into obscurity pretty quickly. Students might use them as study pieces, but they weren't going to fill a concert hall. Those were reserved for people who were still making music now. And despite the giant looming shadow of Bach in the classical world today, that's basically what happened to him too. He wrote over 1,000 pieces in his lifetime, but once he passed, the music world moved on. His manuscripts were kept alive by a couple devotees, including his son Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and his student Johann Philipp Kernberger, but most people, certainly most of the aristocrats whose tastes defined what real music was, just didn't care. So what happened? Well, as is so often the case in the history of classical music, the 19th century happened. This was a period marked by numerous cultural shifts in Europe that made it the perfect breeding ground for a top 10 best composers ever list. First, the turn of the century marked the end of the French Revolution, which led to a decline in aristocratic power and the rise of various forms of democracy across Europe. This meant that composers could no longer rely on a single wealthy patron to pay their bills, they had to turn to the public. But the public already had their own music in the form of folk, and if those two worlds were going to collide, then we needed a way to decide who won. This led to an increased interest in the distinction between high art, the music of the cultured elite, and low art, the music of the unwashed masses. It wasn't about quality, at least not exactly. Folk music could still be a lot of fun, it just wasn't real art because it wasn't made by the right people for the right reasons. And this distinction still exists today. Just look at what happened when in 2018 the Pulitzer Prize Board decided to give the prize for music not to a classical composer like they'd done almost every year since the prize's inception, but to rapper Kendrick Lamar for his fourth album, Damn. That decision faced a lot of pretty extreme pushback, and not because the album itself was bad. I mean, some folks argued that it was, but many of the people upset at the decision never even bothered to listen to it. They were just mad because Lamar doesn't make the right kind of music for such a prestigious award, and if the implications of that argument make you uncomfortable, don't worry. We'll get there. But back to the 19th century, this blending of musical worlds meant that members of the burgeoning middle class could boost their social standing by showing an appreciation for the right kind of music, leading to an explosion of music journalism, especially criticism, to help determine what the right kind of music was. Unlike in Bach's time, where wealthy aristocrats could use their power and influence to define cultural taste, now if you wanted to remain relevant, you had to follow the tastes of the culture at large, going to the right concerts, supporting the right composers, and understanding the nuances of the right musical styles. No one person had the authority to decide what was good anymore. Instead, that was determined by the zeitgeist, shaped by experts and carried out by the masses looking to demonstrate their refined musical palates. Attending important events was a signifier of social status, and having the background to hold conversations on the musical luminaries of the day became a tool for upward mobility. At the same time, we also saw an increased interest in history. Audiences wanted music that had stood the test of time. This led to a revival of composers like Bach, Handel, and others, a trend that merged with the developing concepts of high and low art, resulting in a clear stratification where old music was good music, and you could show off how cultured you were by knowing how to appreciate, say, a Bach fugue. This growing interest in music history also found its way to the Academy, especially in the later part of the century, culminating in the release of the first ever academic journal of musicology in 1885 by Friedrich Chrysander, Philipp Spitta, and Guido Adler. Published in Leipzig, Germany, the first issue featured an essay by Adler entitled The Scope, Method, and Aim of Musicology, where he effectively laid out a mission statement for the fledgling field that still influences the way we study music to this day. He divided musicology into two main areas, historical and systematic, which loosely map onto our modern understandings of musicology and music theory, or at least the American understanding. European schools tend to break things up differently, but that's a topic for another video. Point is, the work of Adler and his colleagues served to help crystallize the canon, further legitimizing its at the time current incarnation. But if you know your history, you'll know that a newfound interest in the scholarly study of musical composition and history wasn't the only thing going on in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There was also... oh no. No. Alright, look, I'm gonna say this as plainly as I can. All across Europe, but especially in German-speaking countries, there was a sharp rise in nationalism. There was a growing desire for a unified Austro-German identity, and we all know how that turned out. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying the canon is bad because it developed out of the same cultural movement that gave us the Nazis. Don't get me wrong, it's a huge red flag, but on its own, it doesn't prove anything. I mention it because people like me often get accused of politicizing the canon, but the fact is, the canon has always been political. German composers are vastly overrepresented on the list because German musicologists made the list at a time when German identity was viewed as a pretty big deal. Were those musicologists actively trying to bias the world's perception of great music toward their own composers? I mean, yeah, some of them definitely were. Heinrich Schenker, for instance, who's currently facing some very well-deserved criticism in the music theory world, but again, topic for another video, was pretty explicit in his celebration of the German masters, and his work, which has had a profound influence on music academia for close to a century, was based almost exclusively on their techniques. Others, though, probably didn't do it on purpose. If you were living in Germany at the time, then it had likely just seemed natural to believe that the great German composers were the great composers, because that's whose work you were hearing. It's what the people around you seemed to be into. But whether or not they intended to shape culture, culture was shaped, and that legacy remains in the modern canon today. That's because the canon is effectively an object of inertia. It's an emergent cultural phenomenon, sure, but it's also a self-perpetuating truth. As we saw at the beginning, you don't actually have to like Beethoven in order to know that he belongs, which makes it easy to pass that idea on from generation to generation, further solidifying his status as a uniquely gifted composer as time goes on. That's not to say the canon can't change, but it doesn't want to. Adding or removing a composer from the list requires a huge amount of societal pressure over a long period of time, because lots of institutions rely on it remaining the same. Orchestras, for one, where programming is easier if the good songs never change, but a stable canon is also really useful in the world of academia, because it guarantees us a touchstone that we can use to reach across generational divides. If we had to update our music theory curricula every time a new hit record came out, we'd never have time for anything else, but if we all just agree that Beethoven made the best music, then I can just teach you Beethoven stuff and you'll know how to make the best music too. Of course, most of those lessons will be completely useless when it comes to the music you actually care about, but really, isn't that your fault for not caring about about Beethoven in the first place. I mean, he's the greatest composer who ever lived. Everyone knows that. So, okay, maybe it's not great for music students, but if you're not a music student, then what's the problem? Well, the thing about making a list of the best music is that you have to decide what to leave out, and those decisions have profound consequences. We already saw that the classical canon is dominated by Germans, but even more than that, it's dominated by white men. Every broadly agreed upon member of the canon is both white and male, and that makes sense. It's a product of its time, and since we've barely updated it since the late 1800s, it'd be more surprising if it wasn't all white guys. But can we actually do anything about that? A lot of defenders of the canon would argue that we can't. While they're definitely very sad about it, ultimately this is just reality. After all, back in the halcyon days of classical music when the true geniuses put ink to score, women, people of color, and other marginalized groups simply weren't encouraged to pursue music, and as we all know, if you don't encourage someone to do something, then they definitely won't do it. Of course it'd be great if we could include women and people of color, but their works just don't exist, or if they do, they don't measure up to the works of the masters. These defenders are effectively citing what Dr. Ann Schreffler calls the invisible hand of the canon, the idea that somehow the canon isolates and cultivates the best examples of music throughout history, and if those examples happen to have clear biases in terms of race, nationality, and gender, among other things, then so be it. We shouldn't sacrifice musical quality for the sake of inclusivity, right? But it's a pretty flimsy argument because, as Dr. Schreffler points out, it never really goes into detail about the process through which the canon determines musical quality in the first place. There are classical composers of color like the Chevalier de Saint-Georges and William Grant Still, female composers like Amy Beach and Clara Schumann, and composers who are both like Florence Price. By what metric are their works inferior to Beethoven's, keeping in mind that, again, many people who believe Beethoven is great have never really engaged with his work? How is the canon measuring the quality of his music, and why is he scoring so high? The honest answer is that it probably has very little to do with musical quality at all, and much more to do with cultural circumstances. Beethoven was the big name in German music at the beginning of the 19th century, just as many of the trends that would eventually lead to the modern canon were kicking off. He was in the right place at the right time, and history rewarded him for it. That's it. Beethoven's music has stood the test of time because, after a while, time just stopped testing it. So does Beethoven suck at music? Nah, I don't think so, but more importantly, I think that question misses the point. It doesn't matter if his work is good in some abstract, objective sense. What matters is what his work means to you, and I think it's okay to admit if it means nothing. That'd be a nice note to end on, but there's still one looming question we should really address before we go. What do we do with the canon? If it's so flawed, how do we fix it, or should we even bother? Is it too far gone to be worth saving? Well, I don't know. It's a hard problem and one that experts have been fighting over basically since its inception. I don't have all the answers, but I do know this. The problems of the canon can't be fixed ad hoc. We can't just slap a couple non-white composers in there and call it a day. That doesn't change anything, although, hey, we should probably still do it anyway. Couldn't hurt. But what I'd like to see is less a change in the canon's makeup and more a reimagining of its role in modern musical culture. I mean, look, if you wanted to make a list of all the best white male composers from German-speaking countries in the 18th and 19th centuries who got at least some level of recognition at the time, the Western classical canon isn't a bad effort. We probably missed a couple, and we'd still have to define best in a way that was measurable first, but at least it's a solid starting point. The problem is that that's not what the canon is presented as. That's not how we treat it. When you take that same list and teach it as just the best classical music, or even the best music full stop, you present a deeply distorted view of history that prioritizes an abstract sense of elitist historical gatekeeping over the actual pursuit of musical quality. And that has real-world consequences. The canon and the unchanging face of high art have a profound impact on who gets funding, awards, opportunities, and prestige. Remember, despite being one of the most critically acclaimed names in modern hip-hop, people were outraged at the idea that Kendrick Lamar could possibly deserve a Pulitzer. But music is an evolving art. It thrives on new voices and new ideas, but the canon clings to an imagined past of pure musical genius that has somehow faded from the world, ignoring thriving, modern, revolutionary musical movements pioneered by artists with completely different ideas about what music can be, often informed by radically different cultural traditions than the one the European canon is based on, and for what? An easier programming schedule for your local orchestra? I don't know about you, but that sounds like a bad deal to me. That's not to say we should forget our past, but I don't think we should write off the present either, and that's exactly what the canon does. One of the biggest problems with prioritizing the canon is that it means music students don't really learn about skills that are relevant to other repertoires. Things like digital audio workstations get left out of the curricula because Beethoven didn't need a computer, so why should you? If you want to learn about those sorts of things, you're gonna have to turn elsewhere, and one great resource for that is Skillshare. They have lots of great classes on mixing, mastering, and navigating a DAW. One I'd really recommend is called Trap Music Production by production duo K-Theory. It's based on writing trap music, but many of the lessons are applicable to anyone trying to work with music software, taking you through a lot of the options opened up by new technology. technology. If you want to check that out, or if you want to check out any of Skillshare's thousands of other classes on production, songwriting, marketing, cooking, and more, they're even offering 2 free months of premium access to the first 1,000 12-tone viewers to click the link in the description. Plus, if you like what you see, sticking around is super affordable with premium plans starting under $10 a month. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Susan Jones and Jill Sundgaard. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.